Hi, everyone. We'll get started in a couple of minutes. I'm Mina, the host. But of course, we just would love for everybody who is joined to share where you're where you're joining us from today. It's one of our favorite things to see where everybody's joining us from today. We often have people from Malaysia, from different parts of Europe, and are always so grateful to see where you're coming to us from. Look, someone from Brazil, Rhode Island. Oh my gosh, it's going so quickly. I can't even keep up. South Africa, Raleigh, North Carolina. It's like this all the time. I love
Amazing.
seeing all the folks from Canada because, of course, I'm originally from Canada. So it's a little bit like a blast from home. Folks from New Zealand, I can't tell you what a gift it is. So many of you who come to us from these time zones where it's either incredibly late or incredibly early your time, that you would gift us with your time and your attention so late in your day is so terrific. Someone from Brooklyn, I lived in Brooklyn for 20 years. So thank you all for joining us. And if you're new to the podcast, you see it happening. We love to see this. So at some point, definitely drop in your name and where you're coming to us from today. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the live recording of Creative Confidence, where we talk to subject matter experts about creativity, leadership, innovation, and growth. As I mentioned, I'm your host, Mina Seetharaman. I'm the head of new ventures at IDEO and of the team here at IDEOU, and we are really delighted to be here today among this amazing community. It's always an active chat. I can't wait to see what happens today in the chat because today's topic is one that I find super fascinating: how to think like a futurist. We are going to talk about making the future tangible, actionable, and near term, not sort of a far flung fiction. Our guest today is Jennifer Lowe, a fellow IDEOer, who's Senior Director of Design Futures at IDEO. Jen, thanks for joining us today.
Glad to be here.
I've been really excited about this, both because every time I talk to Jen, I just feel like I walk away a little bit mind blown with a lot of stuff to think about, but also because I feel like super lucky to be able to consider her a friend. So this will be a lot of fun for me and hopefully a lot of fun for all of you as well. Before we dive into it, though, I do want to share a little bit, Jen, about your background. So indulge me a little. Jennifer Lowe is a futurist and organizational designer here at IDEO, where she helps leaders and teams imagine and build toward a more intentional future. She began her career as an ER and cardiothoracic nurse, bringing deep empathy and systems awareness to all her work. At Kaiser Permanente, she spent more than a decade leading innovation and strategy, where she built and scaled a design and foresight practice that supported more than 250 physician and administrative leaders. She currently teaches at UC Berkeley Graduate School of Public Health, where she combines human centered design and futuring to help students drive change in some of the most complex systems that any of us basically engage with. And she's also a fellow at the Aspen Institute's First Movers Program, where she's advancing the concept of tangible futuring, a practical, grounded approach to strategic foresight. And we'll talk a little bit about that actually in today's conversation. Her work spans public media, healthcare, government, and retail, including a recent role as futurist in residence, where she built custom tools, curricula, and leadership training for one of the world's biggest companies. So, we, as always, will take your questions at the end. So, make sure to drop them into the chat as we go. And just a brief reminder that if you enjoyed our conversation today, you should also sign up for the IDOU newsletter and subscribe to the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. But now, Jen, let's get into it.
Absolutely.
I want to start with the basics because I think when people, you and I have joked about this before, when people hear, oh, I'm a futurist, or, like I do futures work, they kind of imagine some sort of like corporate fortune teller with a magic 8 ball or something. And like you and I both know this is not the work that you do. So I'd love to start with the fundamentals of what is futuring and why is futures thinking so important?
Kind of wish it was corporate fortune telling. That sounds amazing. Futures is actually a really broad term. And essentially, the easiest way to describe it is to say it's exploring or imagining all the possible futures. And that includes things that are truly possible, things that are plausible, things that we don't want to see happen, things that we hope happen. And it is a case of just opening your mind to the possibility of it. It's a very, very broad term. There's a lot of other things that fall under futuring. But the important thing to remember is that it's not about prediction. It's more about opening an aperture and then establishing readiness for what could come. So, less about being able to pinpoint what will happen and more about preparing for what could happen.
I really love that actually. And I'd love for the team, we have a graphic that I'd love for us to share. So if the team wouldn't mind putting that up, it's and I'll start to describe it, both because I think it sets some good groundwork for the things you're talking about, but also because when this is edited as a podcast, of course, people won't be able to see the graphic. But it's something called the Futures Cone. And if you imagine, for those who aren't with us right now, who aren't watching, imagine just an ice cream cone, not the ice cream part, just the cone part on the side. And the narrowest part of that cone is the present day. And then as we travel through time and go into the future, the cone widens, which effectively represents kind of the range of possibilities and uncertainties that can impact the future. And then as a result, the broadening of scenarios that can happen at the widest end of the cone. And so that really represents what you were talking about, which is sort of the full range of possible futures
Absolutely.
that you would explore as you start to do this kind of work.
And what it really points out is something we'll talk a bit more about, I'm sure, during this session, which is there's just this massive range of plausible futures, massive range of possible futures. And then there's this opportunity to actually look for and identify a preferred future. And that's really the key. That's why using futuring becomes so important. It's the ability to identify that preferred future and then actually take action steps towards it. So it's kind of the lifeblood of futuring work as it is.
When you talk about like preferred futures or even just using the futuring cone, you've used the term near future before. Is there sort of an ideal time frame? Like in some of the reading I've done, people recommend kind of like a 10-year time frame sometimes
Mm.
because it's far enough out that people can imagine changes have happened, but not so far out that we're in like, I don't know, like kind of unimaginable territory for most
Right.
people. I didn't know if you had a range that you think is useful to look at.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. I get asked this question a lot, especially from students. And I will admit that I don't always give the answer that people want to hear, but near futuring is kind of my neck of the woods. I think of it as starting a little bit where the strategy horizon is starting to fade and ending, within about a 5 to 15 year time frame. And I say that because the 10-year time frame is one that we're all kind of familiar with in futuring. It's pretty typical, but some industries can be out 10, 15 years in their timeline without even being future forward because the
Right.
amount of time it takes for their industry to establish something. And others, the change is so fast that 5 years is really futuristic. So it just depends a little bit on the industry. But I would say between 5 and 15 years is what I would consider near future, that center place being about 10 years. Um, but really the key of near futuring is to sort of stretch that strategy horizon out. So actionable, tangible futuring kind of falls in that range.
I think that's really helpful. And actually, that industry lens is a really good one that I hadn't given a lot of thought to. Because if you make, I don't know, hard goods like a computer or a phone or something that has a very complex supply chain, that manufacturing timeline is probably like 10 years isn't that big a deal, right? But if
Right.
you make digital products, things can pivot much more quickly. And so as a result, I think that 5 year might seem like you're looking out really far. When I worked in media and I was a chief strategy officer, I would be asked to write these, like write a strategy that looks 5 years out. And it's like the world could be completely different in 5 years from a media perspective, right? So
Absolutely.
that industry lens is a really helpful one. And you said something that I thought was really important, that it's not really about prediction, it's about preparation. I think that's such a good item to highlight for folks.
Yeah, I think that's one of the misnomers about futuring, right? Is this idea that we can go 10, 15 years out and pinpoint exactly what's going to happen. That's obviously not true. But you can be more prepared. I think this is starting to be a little bit of a a stale example, but I think it's a really important one. If there's any company, any industry, any leader who walked away from 2020 thinking that we were well prepared for that and really not being very strict with their analysis, right? Actually, we all got caught unawares. And that was from, everything from public health to technology to manufacturing. Recognizing that we were not as nimble as we thought we were, that we weren't able to pivot as quickly as we thought, is a great example of where more future forward thinking is critical, especially in leadership,
Yeah,
right?
that
Where
was my next question. Right.
absolutely. So futuring as it relates to leadership is really critical, in my opinion. And really for I would think like four things. And we'll kind of talk through them a little bit. But the first one is kind of a model of change that I've had in my head for a really long time. And I like it because I think it really illustrates how different the world is today than it was even 5 or 10 years ago. So I like to think of change and the futuring timeline as sort of a wave. And you can ride that wave, you can get hit by that wave, or you can stand on the shore and try to decide which wave to jump on. Right. And I think for a long time when we talked about, I did lots of transformation and innovation work, prior to 2020. And I would talk about you can stand on the shore. You can stand on the shore a little bit and evaluate which wave you're going to jump on. But the world is increasingly VUCA. So if you're not familiar with the term VUCA, VUCA is a term that gets thrown around a lot in futuring. But VUCA stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And it's this really great way of describing how the world feels, right? Absolutely
Right.
right now. And we talk all the time that the world seems to be getting more VUCA as the days wear on, right? Feels more VUCA today than it did yesterday. And because of that, if you're looking at that wave analogy, the idea that you can stand on the shore and sort of sit and methodically look at which wave you want to grab just doesn't exist much anymore. Literally and figuratively, that shore is eroding. And you're going to have to make decisions based on those waves that are coming very quickly at you, whether it's agentic AI or workforce issues or whatever the case may be. So leadership really does need a chance to look further out to develop that capability of futuring, because what futuring kind of comes down to is pretty simple. It's either offense or defense. If you're on offense, you're looking to capture opportunity that somebody else won't have, right? So you're looking to grab a market that's new
Right.
or set the market or establish a nascent paradigm, whatever the case may be. If you're using it for defense, then you're thinking about being nimble, being prepared, being able to pivot quickly. You're thinking about things like modularity and different models that allow us to make decisions more quickly. You can also be doing both. There's no question about it, but it can be boiled down pretty simply. For leaders, there's a need for them to really balance this. So they need to have a deep understanding of where they are today. That's absolutely necessary, right, for business to happen. And they also have to have a deep respect for legacy and historical precedent. And that's a big part of futuring, which we can maybe go into in a different session. But they also have to have a balance and a foot sort of out, up and out, looking forward in order to be able to capture that. And in order to do that well, they've got to have a flexible, nimble mindset. So that futuring piece has to be coupled with the ability to have some open-mindedness or some flexibility in thinking, not so different from design. And finally, they really have to have the ability to establish a clear vision for a preferred future. So if we went back to our cone and you saw all the possible futures and the plausible futures, there's also that preferred future. So a leader's role really is to find that preferred future and then establish a vision, right, that allows their
Right.
organization to understand they have agency to make that preferred vision real, that preferred future real. So they can set that future. They can, go after that nascent paradigm. Um, and that's something that we see all the time, even in industries that have been quite concrete in the way they manage things. Great example would be the space industry. Um, you know, s- space satellites and going to that was all done in a very particular way. In a way, it was kind of a scarcity model, right? NASA was the main component. Everything was done through them. It was very methodical. It was about safety. It was, things took time, but it was definitely a scarcity model. Whereas what we've seen in the last 10 years in that industry has been a move to a much more abundant and distributed model. So you have something like Planet Labs, right, who turns it on its head and says, I don't want to make bigger or faster. I want to make smaller, networked, right? Tiny satellites that we can put up easy and cheap. So, such an interesting way to think about it. But it's leaders that can think that way, that can look at that, that become, really powerful.
I think there's so much in there that I think is really rich to think about. When you talk about VUCA, I've been thinking a lot about VUCA probably for the last 3 years because I'm a child of the Cold War. I grew up at that time, and we used to talk a lot about VUCA then, but VUCA Cold War is not the same as VUCA now. And so there really are these contextual moments that might shift, to your point, like we had VUCA then, it was okay to kind of stand on the shore and see what the wave did. It's not really okay to do that now. So it's really important, I think, to pay attention to what's happening right now in the zeitgeist that maybe wasn't happening 10 years ago. Like, not to always rely on that legacy view, but to get more of a sense of the pulse of what's happening now to help you look a little bit forward. And I also love that juxtaposition of scarcity versus abundance. Because I do think sometimes we tend to look forward and project futures as if all that is left is to distribute what we have now, or think about like how do we handle what we have now, that the only context is what we have now and that it will need to spread over larger outcomes, as opposed to like how might this be different, like what would have to be true to envision to enable a preferred future that isn't necessarily about how we're operating at this very moment. Super interesting.
It is. And I think, it's not an easy task for leaders to be future forward. The day to day is it's
Yeah.
pretty intense. I was an operational leader at one point as well. So I recognize and understand how difficult that balance is. One of the things that can be really frustrating about futuring, to me, it's super exciting. But to folks that are just getting into futuring, is that you are always opening the aperture when you're futuring, right? And that can feel so uncomfortable that you're not necessarily going to get to a place where you can say, you know, this is it. This is what it's going to be, and we're going to go after it. It's not predictive. Um, and that can feel uncomfortable, but it's suggestive. And there are certainly steps that you can take. And there's a lot that we can do with a preferred future to reverse engineer from that preferred future and get to strategic steps, to tactical steps that you can take now, knowing and understanding that you do that with a sense of flexibility, right? That you're ready to
Yeah.
move if it changes. Just for exactly what you said, Cold War VUCA is not today's VUCA.
Yeah. Um, and I really like that idea of it's not like the options aren't finite, right? That I
Correct.
actually find that really comforting, because one of the things that I hear when I hear you talk about the skills that leaders need about being nimble and being flexible, just that idea of being able to pivot. And you have to be able to see more than one preferred future because not everything turns out exactly as you'd planned. So where do you go next? I think that's a really I find that comforting as someone who leads a team, frankly, and because it doesn't mean that there's only one right answer. I want to pivot a little bit and talk about, you've shared with us and you share with our clients, of course, as well, that there are simple ways to practice futures thinking. And I wanted you to maybe walk us through a little bit of that approach. So, how
Sure.
exactly does one think like a futurist?
Um, well, let's start super, super high level, and then we
Yeah.
can kind of jump into some things that are a bit more tangible for people. At the highest level, there's in the back of my mind, there's a little approach that always is sort of there. So the first part is without question, deep curiosity. So this is one of the things that can be really important for individuals who want to take this on. You have deep knowledge and experience in your industry. And because of that, you're already sort of halfway there, right? So deep curiosity and knowledge about where things are today and historical precedent that's out there. So eyes open, right? Ears open. The second thing is then learning how to do really broad exploration of very, very edge stuff, right? Way out on the periphery. And we'll talk more in detail about what that looks and feels like. And then adding into that a big, huge dollop of creativity, which is basically what you're doing. So you have these known things, these these known but edgy things, and then this dose of the ability to take that and imagine with it. And then you want to get to a place where you can ask really open questions. Again, you're always looking for more questions instead of answers. And those questions are, what if this happened? What could that mean? How might humans behave in that world? What would that mean for my organization that creates this product or provides this service? What would that mean for our workers? Kind of world would they be living in, right? So you're asking all those questions and you just keep opening that aperture further and further. And imagine that you're doing that for multiple stories of the future or multiple possibilities, right? So big, big aperture. That's at the highest level, sort of what you're trying to do. And I think, the other part, and again, I won't go into big detail on this, but the other part is to stay away from sort of what we call used futures, right? These sort of these ideas of the future that have been planted in our head from years and years of watching TV shows when we were kids or movies or science fiction writing or what companies want you to think the future will look and feel like, right? So we have all that stuff swirling in our head all the time. And so avoiding that used future at the same time that you're kind of getting your hands around the possibilities and deploying some creativity in the process.
We won't dwell on used futures. I will say you actually just released a great piece on ideo.com/thinking. We'll share it as part of the follow-up because I
Oh,
think
great.
I really enjoyed it and I loved your reference to Rosie from the Jetsons. I thought that was a really that I felt like that was it made me realize you and I grew up at the same time because it's like I totally wanted a Rosie as well. But I think this notion of used futures is really interesting because again, it's sort of the one of the risks it sounds like is that we end up sort of not envisioning how something could be, but
Absolutely.
actually kind of the incremental massaging of how we've always seen things be. And so that idea of there's a question that we often ask in our work at IDEO that I love, which is like, what would have to be true if? So when a client says, that's not how it works here, so we can't do that idea, we say, well, what would have to be true to make that idea work if we think that's the right idea? And it feels a little bit like that's a little bit of how we approach this or could approach this in the questioning that we would do if we wanted to think more like a futurist, which is what would have to be true to make a preferred outcome like a like a possible like a real like plausible outcome, for us.
Absolutely. And actually, what you're talking about is one of the things that I think um, is is actually really important about the way we're doing this work at IDEO, which is it's a marriage between design and futuring.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and what that, we kind of are coining or thinking about it in terms of tangible futuring because we're talking about things that you can kind of react to that feel real so that you can then imagine further, which is something you have to do for people. It's incredibly hard to think about the future. I put this in the article, but it's something that I think was really interesting. It was just an experiment I tried, which is I would talk to big groups or I would talk to students and I would say, okay, close your eyes. So typical visioning exercise you might do at the beginning of a futures workshop. And you'd say, think about the year 2040. What does it look and feel like? And what you would get back would be, sort of the plots of several movies that you'd seen or books that you'd read, right? Because we all have that in the back of our head and there's some comfort with things we already know. But that doesn't get you anything that's new or that different, right? Because we all have a bit of a discomfort with the idea of something we can't quite put our hands around. But if you then ask the question, imagine your birthday party in 2040. What does that look like? Who's there? Where are you?
How
How do
does
you
it
feel?
feel?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what it does is it just grounds it in some things that are really human and comfortable. And then from there, you can start to say, well, what if, right? What if it was taking place in this way? What if you were there, right? What if you were sitting on Mars in a colony? What would that look and feel like? Would those same people be there? What would need to be true for that to be the case, right? So you can start to take them from a place of comfort and grounding really in human centeredness, but then cast way out with that what if question. So the two work really well together. I'm glad you brought it up because that's one of my favorite, one of my favorite design tools is that question, what would need to be true? It's so simple, but it works beautifully. And it works beautifully connected to things from futuring. So that's really the next step you want to take them to is like, what could you imagine based on this concept?
And the example you gave is such a really lovely personal one, but you and I've talked about this before. I feel like it would work. You could sit with somebody's C-suite and say, so
Absolutely.
the year's 2050 and you're prepping for your next board meeting. Like, what does that feel like? What are you talking about? Like,
Absolutely.
and it's an interesting way of getting them to shape a preferred future. And then to your point, kind of pull it back into, so what are the next three things you need to do in the coming year to take steps toward that, for example? It's super interesting to me.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's talk a little bit. We sort of started to delve into that a little bit. We talked about the mindset and the kinds of questions. What are some tools that people can use as
Sure.
they're thinking about this?
Sure. I think I'll go through a couple sets of tools, and maybe this is, fodder for a later session. We can get in a little more detail, but I think there's really two categories of tools that are really critical at the start. And the first one, without question, are the building blocks of futuring. So most people are aware of these, but I'll go through them. And that's trends, drivers, and signals, right? These are like the kind of fundamental building blocks of any story of the future. And their purpose is to help illuminate possibilities, right? So you're really looking at telling a story of the future, and these are the places that you're getting the sort of inkling from about that story. And I used to have a really strong feeling about starting with signals when I taught people how to do futuring. I'm starting to change my mind about this a little bit. I like people to drop in trends. I think trends are so easy to get your hands on these days. And I'm going to say this, but please don't, stick with us. Don't go and Google this. But you could Google trends 2025 and you're going to get 50 trends reports. And they're all really well researched and really well thought out. And a lot of different groups put them out there. And you can start to take a look. It's one of the things I almost always do in January is I'm sitting with all these trend reports and I'm thinking about them and I'm looking for a lot of different things. Where are their hotspots? Where does every trend report hit? What's one that makes me think, like one that's different from every other one? What's missing? What did I expect to see? Because I have my ear to the ground a lot in terms of signals and trends. So, what did I think was going to be in these? And who's creating this trend report and what's their perspective on it? So, starting with trends actually is an easy place to start. And it's a good way to kind of jump into the near future a little bit because trends reports tend to be today and early tomorrow, right?
Yeah.
The next thing is, having your analytical mind being fed all the time in terms of drivers. So drivers are big forces that we can't ignore that impact how we think about things and decisions that we make as individuals or organizations. And so to get sort of comfortable with drivers, you really have to be a person whose eyes and ears are always open and you're familiar with what's happening across a huge variety of areas. So we have a tendency to use the STEEP model for this. So for those who don't know the STEEP model, it's social, technical, environmental, economic, and political. And so it's great because those are like buckets that you have in your head, and you fill those buckets regularly. And you fill them with legitimate news sources or industry information or university research. And always in your mind, you have a sense of what the drivers are. So you've got a sense of the drivers, these big behemoth forces, and a sense of the trends, these things that are gaining momentum, right? And then you can drop into what are our signals, which to me are the key building block of any futuring. And signals are a little bit what I alluded to earlier. There are these things out on the edge, out on the periphery that are happening today that give us an inkling of what could be in the future, what's plausible in the future. And by their nature, they're like an N of one person, one organization, one university, tiny, tiny, way out on the periphery. All right. If they're not on the periphery, they're a trend. And that's why I said I think I like people to start with trends first, because I think we often, including experienced futurists, find signals or misallocate signals that are really trends, right? But those signals that are way out in the periphery on the edges, they give you a glimpse of that further out future. What could be, what could gain momentum and be interesting. What's really powerful about that is we don't usually take any steps or make any changes or tell any stories of the future based off one signal. It's a pretty bad idea. That there's like an alchemy is the easiest way I can think of to describe it that a futurist uses, right? There's an alchemy that takes signals and trends and drivers and kind of mixes them up. And the alloy that comes from that alchemy are stories of the future, right? The potential, the plausible, the preferred, those come from that alchemy. And so you're constantly mixing those to come up with things that are unique and different and interesting. And then you can start to think, is this an offensive move or a defensive move, right? That's where you're starting to put it into the organizational context. So I would
That's
say yeah, that's the first set of tools I would use. The second part comes from my, great love of human-centered design, and where I live every day at IDEO with the brilliant designers that I work with, and that is then deploy tangibility. Do
mm,
whatever you can to make it real so that you can get feedback on it and open the aperture further. So prototyping things, building artifacts of the future, storytelling, any kind of tool like that where you can take these, this crazy alloy that you built and you put it somewhere where you can get people to think about it and talk about it. Again, not to be predictive, but to be suggestive of what could be.
I think that's I love the idea of deploy tangibility, and I've heard you say before, which to me is an aspect of this. We don't need a time machine to be able to do futuring work. We just need a prototype. It helps us to see what the future might hold, or where our suppositions might be like a little bit right, a little bit wrong, where we might need to flesh things out a little bit. And so that idea of tangibility, I think, really helps us. And again, it makes it feel so much less far flung than I think most people think of the future. Um, I wanted to sort of briefly touch on, I mean, we could talk forever. I wish this were a 2 hour podcast, though I'm not sure the audience agrees with me. They're like, that's enough, Mina. But how do we bring some of this into organizations? Like how
Yeah.
can companies start to, because as I'm looking at the chat, some folks are talking a little bit about like, creativity is not as valued as it could be, or imagination
Yeah.
isn't seen as a strategic skill. So how should companies start integrating futuring into their culture?
Ooh, I love this question. Maybe because this is kind of my neck of the woods.
Yeah.
I think you mentioned at the top of the hour, but I'm a futurist, but I'm also an org designer. So my whole point of view kind of wraps around how do we, what do we do to bring it into an organization successfully? Um, Best advice I can give is think big and start small, or think far and start near. Don't douse the place with provocation day one. That's a recipe for disaster. What you want to think about if you want to bring futuring into your org is how can you cultivate curiosity over time, right? And bring the group in. The reality is futuring is not it's not this crazy thing that only a few people can do. It's a learned capability, right? Some people are better at it than others. Some people have the time to do it and others may not. But at the end of the day, it's like learning a language or working out a muscle. It needs to be practiced and used, right? And any one of us can be future forward in our thinking. And that's far more valuable than having a million futurists in the world. There's no question. But it's a learned capability, so it can be brought into an organization fairly easily. And you want to integrate it in a really methodical way. In my opinion, you want to start with leadership because you do have to build the environment for change, right? So if you start at other levels of the organization and they start getting creative and future forward in their thinking and get shot down the minute those ideas come out because
Yeah.
the environment's not ready for it, that's not going to work very well. So I would say starting with leadership is kind of the critical first step. How can we get your C-level executives? How can we get the board? I just did a webinar like 3 months ago on futuring and boards. I think it's really powerful and interesting to think about. Starting there, building that capability, and then going to your frontline, to your younger generation, because they have a different set of capabilities that can be very powerful. They can be a tremendous engine for your futures thinking because they've got their fingers on signals in ways that many of the rest of us don't. We call that reverse mentoring, right? The ability of the
Yeah.
younger
I love it.
generations. Yeah. And then eventually you want to connect all this future forward thinking into actually existing rituals, things that you do every day as part of your culture or your strategy or your planning so that it sticks, so that you're establishing some stickiness. So you're trying to change the way people think and work and do, and then you're going to ensure that that continues to be the case by allowing those important um, internal mechanisms to support that new way of doing.
Um, Okay, we are totally running out of time, and I
Oh
cannot
no.
even tell you. No, no, we're going to keep going, but I can't tell you how many questions. I've never seen so many questions from the audience, so I'm going to get to those very quickly. But
Okay, good.
I do have a question. You've given us some good food for thought on simple ways that we can all start to think like a futurist. The question I'd like to ask you is actually what gives you hope about the future? It's a
Oh,
volatile time. It's a tense time. And
sure.
like what gives you some hope about the future?
I love that question. Especially because I say all the time, I'm an optimistic futurist,
Yeah.
and people think that's a crazy thing to say, but it's true. So now you're going to hear my big manifesto. We have incredible agency that we aren't deploying. Things are going wrong in the world around us, poverty, inequity, loneliness, and we're on the shore waiting for someone else to ride the wave. And that's short-term thinking. That's what ails us, right? So I think the role of the futurist is to open up the thinking, to poke and provoke, for
Love
lack of a better way of
it.
putting it. So and I truly believe that the more we can make futuring available and tangible and possible for people, the more likely they are to start thinking long term. And if everybody starts thinking long term and systemically, we can start solving these big issues that exist. And we can design the future that we want. So it's pretty easy for me to have hope when I think about it that way.
That's amazing. Okay, so I wanted to do a couple of quick takeaways for a moment.
Sure.
One of that's my favorite is really just this notion that futuring is about preparation, not prediction. So this work about being curious, about being observant, about being creative, and about opening up the aperture is really about getting ready for what could come, not about just like pulling a prediction out of thin air.
Right.
Thinking about the near future, 5 to 15 years out, but in a way that is much more long term thinking than this sort of quarter to quarter reporting and focus that we all have. We all go through it. It's the way business runs. But if we can give ourselves space to think in a little bit more of a longer term way, that can help us to really open up the possibilities and see what could happen. You've talked about being curious, paying attention, asking what if, as opposed to limiting ourselves. And that artifacts are really better than abstract ideas. These tangible stories are really things that can help make the future feel real and therefore make it feel more actionable for us. And I want to add one more thing besides, you don't need a futurist title to think like one. I think I loved your point about thinking big but starting small. So, like, start from a big picture, but then figure out ways to integrate that into existing rituals because that's how you get traction and start to build that into a culture. We are going to transition. to Q&A. So why don't we, I like, honestly, there are 50 questions in the Q&A document. There are so many of them, I can't even tell
It's
you.
good. We're opening the aperture. More
Yes.
questions than
So I do
answers.
actually want to say that we will be doing an asked and answered drop. So if we don't get to the question that you asked, don't worry. We'll be doing another, like a second recording. So I'm going to just start picking from them because they're amazing. Devin asks us, what have you observed about Future's work that influences organizational decision making instead of just reporting? They're curious about how design futures and speculative fiction are perhaps more instructive than the scenarios that are more common in today's strategic planning.
Oh,
It's a
wow.
meaty
That's a very
question.
juicy
It
question.
is.
All right. I'll answer the first part of it first, and you may have to remind me the second part.
Sure.
The first part of it, where I have seen it become really successful in terms of integrating it into the way an organization works has been when two things happen in tandem. One, when there's a lot of capability building. So giving people time to learn it in a place where they feel confident, to play with it, right? And then folding it into different places where they can utilize it. So, if you're teaching a group of leaders futuring, don't walk away from that and not use it after that, but have it be integrated into their daily work. So maybe on Fridays, there's a signal session. You spend 30 minutes,
Hmm.
and any signal that anyone picked up is something that you put in front of them. And you play with it, right? Future should be played with. That's its purpose. And then setting those rituals that support it on the back end. Again, I did this when I was at Kaiser Permanente. And one of the things that we did was fold futuring into planning. Planning is the most concrete thing you do every year. And so we had 55 departments who all sat and did, sort of reverse engineering from preferred future back with tactical steps and strategic steps in that timeline. So, very, very concrete way to fold futuring thinking into something that you're going to do every year and that your leaders are going to lead. Can you
Yeah.
remind me of the second part of the
I
question?
actually think you touched on it.
Okay, good.
It was how design futures and speculative fiction are more instructive than
Oh, yeah,
scenarios that are more common in today's strategic planning. And so that idea of folding futures into the planning exercise, I think,
absolutely.
is one way to do that. I don't know if you have others, but that idea of, I think, taking some of those components and folding them into the planning process could be really helpful.
I think that's a big piece of it. I also think, find the people. This is maybe more of a piece of advice back to individuals who want to be a person who's thinking in a futures way or bringing futuring into their org. Find the people. There are a lot of phenomenal futurists and future forward thinkers and design futurists that are writing articles. There are people that there are not a lot of PhD programs that touch on futuring, but there are a few, and they're putting out really interesting work. I read a lot of Bob Johansen. I'm familiar and have always been with Jane McGonigal's work, Stephen Fisher and Phil Bagatis, Matthias Bjornhorf. There are people that I follow all the time as a futurist that I know are going to bring new and interesting things in, and I can start to think about those and build them in and think differently about things that I'm doing. Jane McGonigal, for example, is a big thinker in the futuring space and does a lot with gamification. Gamification is a really interesting thing to bring in so that people can get more comfortable with the future and learn using gamification. Storytelling experts at IDEO, I think that's another place where I've pulled things in. So finding ways to bring it in, it doesn't have to be outlandishly speculative. That's hard to say. In order to be effective, it can be as simple as a near futuring what if exercise, but it can also be something where you take people on a real trip out in time and then pull them back and ground them with questions about how they can think differently today.
Excellent. All right. So I chose a super meaty question, and we are, in fact, starting to run out of time. So, again, tune in for Asked and Answered, the follow up episode to this, because we will answer many more of those questions. So, we always ask our guests one question at the end of our podcast. It is what, and I'll give you time to think about it so you don't have to come
Okay.
up with an answer straight away. What advice would you give your younger self? And while you think about that, If everybody in the audience would like to go a little deeper on today's topic and on strategy, you might be interested in our designing strategy course. You'll learn how to unite rigor and creativity to create a successful strategy. And the next run actually, I think, starts tomorrow. Tomorrow's the 14th, right? So if you want to sign up, today's the day. Don't forget to sign up for our newsletter on IDEOU.com for invites to live events and creative leadership resources. And we do have a podcast survey running. So definitely we'll share the link in the chat and also in the follow up. We want to hear what you want to hear about. So definitely take some time to fill that out. And of course, if you've enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen. Those of you who've already subscribed know that we've started dropping additional episodes like our Asked and Answered series, where our guests take more of your questions. And there are also some other special episodes on the way. And if you know someone who's looking for a little bit more creative inspiration, consider sharing the podcast with them. We'd love to bring that to them. Okay, Jen, what is the advice that you would give to your younger self?
I think lean into curiosity. I used to apologize a bit for my magpie brain, is what I called it. There's like something golden and sparkly on the side, and I would immediately go to it, and I would apologize for that, that I wasn't that focused all the time. Actually think it's a great skill for someone in futuring. And I would say to anybody, whether you have a magpie brain or not, leaning into curiosity is a great thing. If you're curious about it and something piques your interest, you read something and it seems unusual, jump in and figure out what it could be, what it could mean. So that's what I would tell my younger self.
I think that's excellent advice for us all. Thank you so much for this today, Jen. And thank you,
Thank you, Mina.
everybody for joining us today. And we will see you next time on Creative Confidence.